Imagine an empty room, and inside the empty room is a crib. And inside the crib is a little baby girl. She has big, bright eyes. She has puffy cheeks. And she's decided for the very first time that she is going to try and smile. So she feels this urge inside of her chest, and she feels a little flutter of excitement in her heart, and she works with all of her might to offer her very first smile to the world. But remember that the room is empty, and so there's no one there to respond or reply back. Despite being a little bit let down, the baby tries a second time, a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time. And every time the baby smiles, she is met with silence. How would this experience affect the life of this little girl for the rest of her life? Consider this. In the first 5 years of our lives, our brains develop more than at any point in the rest of our lives. Not just in size, but in the brain connections that ultimately form the foundation for how our brains interact with the world around us. I don't know if you've ever been there to watch a child take their first steps. If you haven't, you can probably imagine how the scene might play out. This was my experience last Christmas when my 13-month-old nephew, Brooks, decided that he was going to take his very first steps right there during Christmas. The Christmas tree was up, the gifts were out, the family, the festivities, the food, we were all having all this excitement. I was in the living room with my nephew, and I was holding him up on his feet, and his mom bent down a few feet away, and she said, "Walk to me, Brooks, walk to mommy." As soon as Brooks took his first little wobbly step forward, everything else in the room stopped. Mom said, he's walking, and everybody ran over to watch. He made it about one more step, and he fell flat on his bottom right in front of us. But everybody cheered, "Do it again, Brooks, do it again." And so he offered this little smile. I picked him back up, and I set him in his starting spot. His mom bent down again and said, "Walk to mommy, Brooks, walk to mommy." And on his very second time, Brooks made it all the way to his mom. And as you can about imagine, everybody cheered and clapped and encouraged Brooks. "Good job, Brooks, good job." It was a precious memory for all of us. But even more than that, it was a significant moment in the development of Brooks' brain. Science tells us that during the first few years of our lives, our brains literally form billions of connections, each increasingly complex as the different areas of our brain learn to communicate with one another. These pathways work a little bit like a muscle would. The more we use them, the stronger they become and the more efficient they become. But these neural pathways don't just form on their own. They form as a result of the interaction that we have with the world and the environment around us. The feedback that we get from the people and the things around us are what begin to shape these connections. And in a healthy family, where there's stability and security, these brain connections begin to connect properly and healthily. Just think of all the firsts that a baby goes through. First word, first step, first laugh, first time a baby shares a toy with another child. All of the reinforcement, both positive and negative, begins to form the connections that form the way we interact with the world. Which takes me back to my very first question. What would happen if no one had been there when Brooks decided to take his first step? Or what would happen if nobody was there when a baby smiled for the very first time? How would that lack of interaction affect the connections being made in the brain? Well, we know exactly how it affects. and it's not good. But before I get to that, there's another important fact about the world we live in that I want to share with you. Although it's impossible to know for sure, there are an estimated 15 million orphaned children in the world. 3 to 4 million of these children living and growing up inside an institutional, traditional orphanage. In Mexico alone, 30 to 40,000 children growing up inside the walls of an orphanage. And for those children, this question, what if no one was there the first time they smiled, isn't a hypothetical. It's the reality of the life they're growing up in. You see, in an orphanage setting, we typically have high child to adult ratios. 8 children to every adult, 10 children to every adult, 20 children to every adult, sometimes even more. Orphanages, of course, are doing the best that they can with the resources that they have. But in that type of environment, where workers are doing their best just to provide the basic needs that they can for the children, food, shelter, clothing, security, they just don't have the time or the ability to provide warmth, sensitivity, interaction like a child would receive if they were to grow up inside a family. Again, an orphanage is better than a child growing up on the streets, for sure. But an orphanage can never replicate the attention and affection that a child receives growing up inside of a family. And we've known this for decades. We have decades and decades of research that tells us that an orphanage setting is harmful for children and does not allow them to develop properly. In fact, dating back to the 1930s, studies began to emerge that show that children fall behind physically and psychologically when they grow up inside of an orphanage. When children do not receive adequate personal interaction with a loving environment, development is stunted in almost every dimension of human development. This is something that I think we already know to be true. It makes perfect sense to us as soon as we hear it. The problem is, most of us have never even taken the time to consider it. We see orphanages on television and movies. We picture orphanages all around the world. We never stop to think about the children growing up inside of them and how that environment might be affecting them. But here's what statistics say. Children growing up in an orphanage are 10 times more likely to fall into the sex industry. They're 40 times more likely to have a criminal record. And they're 500 times more likely to commit suicide. There must be a better way. There must be a better way to care for orphaned and vulnerable children. And there is. The family. That's why the Hope Effect is working to change the way the world cares for orphans by focusing on family-based solutions. I love the work that we're doing here in Mexico. We are based in Phoenix, Arizona, and of course there's so many connections between Phoenix and Mexico, especially here in the state of Sonora. In 2016, we took our first trip across the border alongside another nonprofit. And despite knowing nobody before we crossed the border, within 1 hour, we found ourselves in the mayor's office talking to the head of DEEF about our desire to get children out of orphanages and into families. They were excited about the idea, and they immediately connected us with the state government. And almost like magic, doors began to open and opportunities began to emerge to solve this problem, to bring about a better way to care for orphan children. And so the Hope Effect does this in 3 ways. Number 1, we work with governments to change laws to even provide opportunity for children to grow up inside a family environment rather than an institutional orphanage. In 2019, Mexico signed a resolution with the United Nations, essentially making the case that orphan children growing up in a family is better than children growing up inside an orphanage. And so the federal government has made that statement, but it's up to every state and local community to make it a reality in their city and town and neighborhood. In other words, it's up to us to bring about a better way to care for children. But we don't stop at just advocating with the government. The second thing we do is we are on the ground and we are working to bring about family-based solutions. This means we recruit families for a foster care program. We evaluate families to make sure they're a good fit. We train, we certify, we help place children in environments where they can thrive and they can flourish. Every area we work in has a regional director and has a psychologist who follows up with every single family where a child gets placed to make sure that it is an environment where they can become a prosperous adult, that they're receiving education, health care, discipline, work ethic. And the third thing that we do is we work to bring about a self-sustaining model. We work within a local community and with local community leaders to make sure that we bring about a solution to this problem, that we change the way the world cares for orphans on the local level in a way that is reproducible and can occur even after the Hope Effect isn't involved in the day-to-day operations. In other words, we all work together to bring about better care for orphaned and vulnerable children. And when we do, the changes are immediate. I want to introduce you to Anna. Anna's mother tested positive for drugs when she was born. And so she was immediately taken from the hospital and placed into an orphanage, never getting to live inside a family. Last fall, at 18 months old, Anna was placed into a foster family here in Hermosillo. At the time, she couldn't walk. She couldn't say any words. She was behind in almost every stage of human development. But on her very first day in her foster family, Anna began playing with her foster siblings, babbling, imitating, copying her new siblings. And on the second day in her new family, she stood up on her own. And the third day, she walked for the very first time. Not just did she grow physically, but also emotionally and psychologically. She's able to communicate with her siblings and form an emotional bond. She's able to express her needs. She holds eye contact when you have a conversation with her. She even tries to get the family's attention, just like a child should. Also, Marisol. When we first signed our agreement here in Sonora, we took a tour of one of the government-run orphanages. And as we were taking the tour, Marisol, who I didn't know and she didn't know me, she ran up to me and I gave her a hug. We didn't know each other. We also didn't know that Marisol would become one of the very first children in the history of Sonora to be placed into a foster family. After spending the first years of her life inside an orphanage, she had fallen behind, of course, in human development. She couldn't even put together a 4-piece puzzle when she first entered her family. But by the time she went to preschool, she was able to complete a 24-piece puzzle. The teacher was so impressed, and she said, who taught you how to do this? And she said, my foster aunt taught me how to do it. This is what happens when children grow up in families. It's been said that it's easier to repair broken men. It's easier to build strong men than to repair broken men. And this is true. But it's also true that when you change a child, you change the world. Because when you change a child, you bring about positive fruit for generations and generations. That's why the Hope Effect is working to change the way the world cares for orphans, because every child deserves a family. Thank you.